Hello, my name is Pritesh Raichura and I'm the Head of Science at Michaela Community School. I am also a part of the CogSciSci team and I'm really excited to be sharing this curriculum Soapbox, which focuses on writing good biology SLOP. Now, SLOP is one of the CogSciSci favorites in terms of acronyms, and it stands for, as I'm sure you know, shed loads of practice. And the key idea here is that we want pupils to practice as much as they can, because that's the best way for them to understand and master the key ideas we want them to learn. Now, the principles I'm going to be talking about today do, I think, apply to all three sciences. However, the examples I'm going to be using all focus on biology. So let's get cracking straight away. Now, the first thing that I always think about when it comes to SLOP is, don't pupils need a variety of activities? And my answer to that is the following. Well, first of all, the answer is no. And part of the reason is the skills myth. So I used to think, for example, that if I got pupils to do different types of activities, like marketplace activities, for example, then they're developing their communication skills, they're developing their teamwork skills. However, that really isn't the core purpose of a biology or a science curriculum. And the act of teaching new biological content using those activities as a medium it actually hinders both things. You're not really scaffolding the teaching of those skills properly, and you're also not teaching them that content properly in the end, because what we're about to discuss using explicit instruction, which is perhaps things I've talked about before, whereas what I'm talking about here is using shed loads of practice, does help pupils to understand and learn better. So the key questions to ask yourself when thinking about any activities you do with your class are the following. What are pupils thinking about? This is the most fundamental thing. How do the planned activities ensure that pupils understand the content with clarity, that the learning is durable? Are they going to remember it for a long time after you've taught it to them? And thirdly, are pupils learning the correct language? Because science is full of phrases and vocabulary that is tricky to master, and there are not an infinite number of ways of explaining particular concepts. To explain a concept succinctly and accurately, the language use has to be very precise. So do the activities that you're giving your pupils, both in class and for homework, help them to do all of these things? And the thing that I've come to conclude is that SLOP, or shed loads of practice, is the thing that does tick all of these boxes. So if we agree that in our curriculum what we want is a series of lots of questions that complement our explanations, then what's the best way to write those questions? What's the best way to sequence those questions? And what kind of questions and what kind of tasks, what kind of practice really will maximize the learning that pupils experience? So the best activities will help pupils to rehearse key facts and ideas. Memory is the residue of thought. Pupils will easily forget things if they're not rehearsing the ideas, the facts again and again that make up those ideas. Write. We want pupils to write with precise language. How can you design activities or SLOP questions that help them develop the precision of their language? Make links. How can we make links between facts? Because when we say understanding, what we mean is this kind of understanding emerges from making lots of links between the different facts that you practice to fluency. We can tease out misconceptions. That would make really good SLOP questions. And finally, really build understanding. And that kind of comes through all of these other things. So how can we achieve this? So I'm going to be talking about several different types of questions that you might write. Now, the way that I use these kinds of questions is there's two main ways. First of all, as homework, giving pupils just lots and lots of questions for them to answer. And of course, that requires more independent work because I'm not there to guide them and ask them questions along the way or to clarify with explanations any gaps in their knowledge. But also, I use these questions in class in between me delivering chunks of knowledge through my explanations. So these are the different types of questions that I write for pupils to answer. And I'm going to share with you some examples that underlie those principles. And I'm going to share some non-examples so that you can see where teachers often go wrong in terms of writing those kinds of questions. And hopefully that will mean that you have a clear idea of what I mean by each of those principles. Now, what you might notice in this presentation is that there are, I talk about 15 principles, but or there are 15 numbered principles, but I'm only sharing a sample of them. I will be releasing a blog to accompany this with the full set of principles. So the first thing is the idea that your purpose, what you intend for the pupil to get out of the presentation, of the SLOP questions, will inform the question writing. So you might want to pause the video to have a quick read of this. In essence, what I'm saying here is you're either building understanding at this stage of practice, that perhaps happens early on, or maybe for homework, you're maximizing the amount of retrieval that pupils want to do. And this will affect how you write a question. So for example, if I had a series of questions I'm giving my pupils for homework, I might start with questions like, which cell organelle contains the genetic material? There's not much retrieval there. People have lots of clues. They've got, it's a cell, it's an organelle, so that limits the options. It's got the genetic material inside of it. So it really narrows down the options that pupils have. And the answer is, of course, nucleus. However, I wouldn't do that if I was attempting to build understanding, because if a pupil wasn't really clear what the nucleus is, they're going to struggle to answer this question. So I'm, in a way, giving them I'm teaching them new things about the nucleus, or helping them revisit those ideas by having lots of clues in the stem. However, I've swapped the example and non-example round, because if your goal is to maximize retrieval, then it's better that you ask, what is the function of the nucleus? And they have to think, well, it's an organelle that contains the genetic material of the cell. So there's a lot more retrieval involved there. And I would perhaps ask that later on in a sequence, or perhaps I would ask it some time after my explanation, where I'm revisiting something from, let's say, a week ago. So that's my first principle. Second, one of the problems that I see with questions that either I've written in the past or other teachers in my department have written in the past and I've given them feedback on is not being very precise with what you're asking of the pupils. If questions are quite open-ended, but in your head you have an answer that's quite precise, quite narrow, you're not setting them up to succeed if the question isn't directing them strongly enough. So if you're expecting pupils to give 3 reasons for why the cell cycle takes place, say that in the stem of the question. Don't just say explain why the cell cycle takes place, because some of them might write one thing and think I'm done, and then when you give them feedback, it's going to be tricky because they're going to say, oh, I didn't know how to give 3, I'm right, and their attention will shift away from the remaining correct answers because they're focused on the fact that, yeah, I got one of the right answers, therefore I'm correct. So the way you frame the question lets them know that they ought to give 3 responses, and that helps them to really focus when you're giving them feedback. So I only got 2. They can think themselves, I need to think of 1 more, so it's useful for them. But also when you're giving feedback, it becomes obvious to them they need to remember there are 3 key reasons. And second of all, ideas like when you have different types of advantages, if you're looking for a medical advantage, then that would help them narrow down the potential options, and that will make giving feedback easier as well. You might have separate questions for the different types of advantages as well. So that would be my, well, it says 3rd and 4th principle, but of course the rest will be shared on the blog, so number 2. Next, sequence is important. So what I mean by this is if you're asking a series of questions, it's tempting to go for something like, if your lesson's on diffusion, define diffusion and have no further questions. However, the answer to that question, define diffusion, includes things like a concentration gradient, or from a high to a low concentration. That phrase is going to be in their answer. Have you checked that pupils understand what that means, or are they just going to mindlessly regurgitate define questions? And if we really want to make sure our pupils are thinking hard about meaning and not just parroting definitions, it's really important that we tease out the components of a definition to check that pupils understand it. So before you ask define diffusion, you might ask define concentration gradient. And that will help pupils. You're setting them up to succeed in answering this question because you're forcing them to think about what a concentration gradient is in the first place, so that when they then write it in the very next question, they have something that they're thinking about, the concentration gradient with meaning, not just parroting it mindlessly. However, I would argue that this is still quite abstract, because a concentration gradient and writing its definition is still very abstract. So how can we make it more concrete? And if you've heard me speak before, you'll know that I talk obsessively about using concrete examples before using abstract or generalized definitions. Give them something to think about first. So instead of saying what is concentration gradient, you might show them two examples. I've got box A and box B, and they have to first say which one shows a concentration gradient. How do you know? Suddenly, that stimulus, that cue of those two diagrams is forcing them to think, which one is showing a concentration gradient? It's concrete, because every time I say, as an expert, concentration gradient, this is the kind of thing I'm imagining in my head. But for my pupils who perhaps are new to this idea of diffusion, they aren't thinking of these images in their heads. They're just thinking it's a word I've learned recently. And we want them to start associating those two words, concentration gradient, with something concrete, and we want them to picture it in their heads, which is why this would make a really good first question, because they would perhaps have to explain that there are more particles on the left-hand side of box B and fewer on the right-hand side, before then saying what is a concentration gradient. And when they're trying to work out how to articulate it, they can look at the diagram to help them. And then when you ask what diffusion is, there's a much greater chance of them thinking about what a concentration gradient actually is, thereby helping them to build understanding. Now, if you contrast that with when you're writing SLOP questions, if you had just said define diffusion and then move on to the next question, there's all those missed opportunities for them to concretize what that means. And this is a good way of achieving that. Right, next principle, avoid unnecessary questions. What do I mean by this? So this particularly applies to procedures. It's often not very helpful for pupils to write about a procedure that they're doing. What's more helpful is that they can just do it. So if that's the case, you need to make a decision about, is it worth me teaching them all about the language, about how they are using a particular procedure, or is it not worth it? And sometimes, as in this example, there's times where they don't explicitly need to be told certain things. It's easier to teach implicitly because it makes it easier to write questions. Now that might sound contrary to what I often say, which is make everything explicit, but consider this non-example. What do you call the shortened version of an element? Chemical symbol. It's a bit clunky. I don't often say shortened version very often. They're not likely to encounter the words shortened version very often. They just practice and they know symbol, this is what the symbol is for an element. K is potassium, sodium is Na. Just through practice and exposure, they learn that this is the shortened form of this. They don't need to know the language shortened form in order to understand that. So if they don't need to know explicitly that a shortened form is the same as chemical symbol, it's not worth asking a question. Just get them to demonstrate they can do it rather than explain what they are doing. Right, now this is the key thing that I've been working on recently, and actually this is something that I'm yet to try lots of, and so this is where I'd love to spark a discussion about, have you tried some of these things? And if so, what success have you seen in the classroom? And I'm really excited to try these out when we go back in September. So, sentence level construction. One thing I've found is my pupils very often struggle to use newly learnt words in sentences correctly. So for example, I mean, this is not a biology example, but just at the end of lockdown, I was teaching electrolysis, and using the word electrodes was really difficult for the pupils, because they weren't sure how to use it, or things like the word conduct, explaining that they're conductors or that they're conducting rods. They found that really tricky. So I used a jumbled up sentence, and they had to kind of unjumble it, and it actually revealed that a lot of them thought you could use the phrase in a certain way that was completely wrong, which revealed to me that they didn't have an understanding, because they hadn't been exposed to such language before, of how you use the word electrode, conducting rod, graphite in a sentence together. And the activity that I used with them was to unjumble the sentence. Now that sounds like a very primary school activity, but you have to remember that we're teaching pupils lots of new words, and actually what we take for granted is that we know how to use it in a sentence, but our pupils don't. So give pupils a jumbled up sentence. So in this case, cell specialized many differentiate stem types of a cells can into. And they'll spend some time thinking about how I can order this into the right sentence. And the answer would be, a stem cell can differentiate into many types of specialized cells. I think this is really helpful because it forces them to consider word order and syntax so that they become more fluent at it. What I would avoid doing, my non-example, would be something with many clauses. If there's more than 2 clauses in your sentence, it's probably not worth using, because it's just going to take them such a long time to unjumble that, and it's going to give rise to more mistakes than is worth giving feedback for. So short sentences, it works really well for. But again, if you do try this out, I'd love to hear what kind of things it works for you, and any feedback that you have on that would be really helpful for this discussion. The next thing that I'm really excited to be working on more of, and using this more in my lessons and writing it into my resources, is sequencing activities. So giving pupils an explanation that's jumbled up, and they need to put the explanation in the correct order. I've done this a little bit in the past, and it is really interesting, but I think I want to try more of it because it really helps pupils to understand the relationships between facts. So the goal here isn't to force pupils to retrieve, it's to force pupils to order an explanation. And you might go from the first cause to the next, to the next, to the final effect. So I've put here that sequencing activities isolate the practice of relationships between facts and do not require pupils to retrieve anything. So this is the example here. We've got heart rate, breathing rate, and breath volume all increase. This causes an increase in energy demand. Muscles contract more during exercise. The rate of respiration increases. More glucose and oxygen are transported to the exercising muscles. Now, obviously, that's in the wrong order, and people have to think, what's the first thing that happens in this sequence? Is there an increase in energy? But then it starts with this causes, so maybe it's not that. Maybe it's muscles contract more during exercise. That sounds like the first thing. And from there on, there's a lot of thinking involved because they have to think, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? Where I suspect this will be really useful is when you have questions like, explain the effects on the body of muscles contracting more during exercise. What people often do is they'll miss out 1 or 2 of these steps in a 4 or 5 mark answer. They might forget something about energy demand, or they might forget something about the rate of respiration, but they'll have the other things in it. And what I hope such an activity will do, where they have to sequence it, not retrieve anything, just sequence, is it forces them to build this chain of cause and effect in their minds. And later on, as you can see, I've put further down here, what you want to do later on in your shed loads of practice is to have the correct order there, but remove 1 or 2 of the steps. And then finally, I guess the ultimate boss level challenge would be they have to retrieve the full thing on their own, and they have to not only remember all the points, but also make sure they're in the correct order. So you can see how I'm taking away the guidance I'm giving them, this so-called guidance fading, in order to help them to succeed. So this is, I think, a good example because it's really clear. There's one clear answer as to what the causal chain is. What I would say is, if you're ever writing a question and there's multiple correct orders, because I've done that in the past, and it just makes giving feedback really complicated, because you can say, oh, and you could have these swapped around and you could have those swapped around, and it ends up being quite a jumble when giving feedback. So you might want to then consider limiting the types of explanations you get pupils to do this for. Or you can just pick out pairs and say, as long as this pairs are together, you're correct. As long as this pairs together, you're correct. As long as this is last, you're correct. Something like that. But I think it depends on how confident your pupils are with the sequencing of it. Okay, and then the next thing that I'm really excited about is sentence level construction. So this is something I haven't tried much of at all yet, but I'm really eager to try it out come September. The big thing in science that pupils find difficult, in my experience, is something that's so fundamental to science, and it is cause and effect. And using the right conjunctions in between the cause and effect when giving an answer. I've often, even at some of the brightest pupils I teach, been surprised at pupils using the wrong conjunctions. So I'm going to put up an example, and this is what I would do. First, you give pupils two clauses. So the ones I'm giving them here are fewer plants being available, more herbivores dying. And all they need to do is write which is the cause, which is the effect. So they might say, well, the correct answer in this case would be the cause is fewer plants being available, and the effect of that is more herbivores dying. So in other words, more herbivores are dying, and the cause of that is the fact that there are fewer plants being available. So they have to label one as cause and one as effect. Then your next step would be to get them to put those two clauses into a sentence. And you might ask, depending on the level of scaffolding you've reached, you might say, come up with your own conjunction or a word that joins those two clauses to make a full sentence, or you might give them specific conjunctions to use. So you might give them results in or is a result of, and they might say, and they might put that together in a sentence. So I've got another example here. And the reason I've put this example is because I remember a really bright pupil in my class, getting this the wrong way around, and it really surprised me, but it made me realize that pupils perhaps aren't as confident with using the correct syntax when it comes to multi-clause sentences as I'd anticipated. So they might, and what's really interesting is you can actually do this both ways, and your cause and effect would swap around. So you might say, the heart contracting results in blood circulating around the body. But if you were to use as a result of, you would have to swap it around and say blood circulating around the body is a result of the heart contracting. And I think what we're doing here is making really explicit to pupils that the order really matters and the conjunction you use really matters. And it's important they get it right, because only one of those is scientifically accurate. Okay, so I guess my concluding statement here would be that shed loads of practice, writing questions forces pupils to think, yes, but the quality of their thinking really depends on the quality of the questions that you write. And so I hope that this has been useful as a way of helping teachers think really carefully about the types of questions they write and the sequence of the questions that they use, and that there is a clear focus on the purpose linked to what you want for your pupils. So I'm going to use these kinds of questions because we're at an early stage. I'm going to use simple questions that require little retrieval because I'm building understanding. I'm going to use more complex questions where pupils are required to retrieve more information later on. I'm going to use sequencing activities and labeling clauses as a way of getting them to improve their writing skills. So if you have a clear purpose in mind, you know what you want your pupils to think about, you can write better SLOP as a result. So hopefully you found that useful. I'd love to hear from you. Please do tweet. My Twitter handle is there. or you can comment on my blog when the blog post comes out. And of course, always use the hashtag CogSciSci, which will help find these tweets and collate these tweets, and we can have a really productive discussion. Thank you for listening.